Okay, welcome everyone to another terrific program at Merowitz Center, and thanks for joining us. My name is Laura Bryant. Today's program is part of our ongoing Presidential Legacy series. This afternoon, we're featuring Franklin D. Roosevelt, our longest serving president in American history. As a result, our FDR program actually consists of 3 parts. Today is part 2, and the final segment will be next Thursday, January 26th. By the way, last year we featured Abraham Lincoln, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Harry S. Truman. And in fact, we have a special encore presentation about Lincoln on February 1st. Presidential Legacies has turned out to be one of our most popular series, so we're happy to have you. Please welcome back Jeff Urbin, Education Specialist at Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. Last week's program, which was part 1, of course, was fascinating and lots of fun. So Jeff, we're very happy to see you again and can't wait to see what you have planned for today.
Why, thank you very much there, Laura, and welcome back, everybody, if you were here last week, and welcome if you weren't here last week. As you just heard, speaking to you live from the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, and it is miserable here today. It's like in the high 20s and rainy. I don't know why it's not snowing. It was supposed to snow, but it's just a miserable, rotten, cloudy day. And what could be better than spending it with folks that are interested about the Roosevelts? So I thank you for tuning in and allowing me the opportunity to talk to you today. Now, last time out, we talked about the history of the presidential libraries and how these things came about. And today, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about Franklin Roosevelt and sort of his political career, how he got to be president, and then talk a little bit about one of the major crises that he faced while he was president, which of course was the Great Depression. And then next week, what we'll do is we'll talk about his work with World War II and the creation of the United Nations. And then that'll give you kind of a nice, quick little overview of President and Mrs. Roosevelt. So FDR was born here in Hyde Park, and I showed you his birth certificate last time, and he grew up here on the property, and he was homeschooled until he was 14 years old. He was supposed to go away at 12, but his mother couldn't dare to part with him, and so she kept him here, and he was tutored by private tutors until he was 14 years old. Then he went to Groton School over in Massachusetts, and he got there 2 years after everybody else got there because his mom had kept him home. So when he got there, he was kind of out of sorts and everything. Everybody else had made their friends, created their cliques and those sorts of things. And so he was kind of like the odd man out. So Endicott Peabody, who happened to be the head, the head of the Groton School, took him under his wing, and they became lifelong friends. And in fact, Endicott Peabody married Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt in 1905. So FDR goes to Groton School, then he goes to Harvard, and he ends up getting a history degree. He goes to Columbia to work on a law degree, but before he gets the law degree, he takes the bar and he passes, so he never actually finishes the degree. And then he begins to work in law in New York City as, sort of a junior, low-level law, not quite a clerk, but, one of those low level, fresh out of school lawyer types in New York City. And one day while he's sitting there in his office, him and the other guys are chatting about, oh, what are they going to do with their careers and what are they going to, what's going to happen? And they said, hey, what about you, Franklin? What do you want to do? And Franklin said, well, I'm going to be president of the United States one of these days. And he's only like 24 years old, 23 years old when he says this. And they're like, yeah, sure, right, right. And he said, no, I'm going to be president of the United States, and I have a plan on how to get there. And his plan was to follow the path of his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt. So let's take a look at those guys. If you go back to 1640, the first Roosevelt came to this country from the Netherlands, and he settles in New York, and he has 2 sons. His name is Nicholas. He has 2 sons, and these 2 sons begin the 2 branches of the family. One son settles in Long Island in Oyster Bay, and that becomes the Teddy Roosevelt side of the family. And the other son works their way up the Hudson River, up here into the Mid-Hudson Valley, into the Hyde Park area, and this becomes the Roosevelt side. Now, I say that because if you know anything about the way these guys pronounce their names, the Roosevelts of Long Island generally pronounce the name as Roosevelt, and the Roosevelts of the Hudson Valley pronounce it the correct way, Roosevelt. Okay, so that's what we like to think of it. So if you hear somebody talking about Teddy Roosevelt, they're right. If you hear someone talking about Teddy Roosevelt, not quite. So anyway, the way it works out is Teddy Roosevelt is on that side of the family, and Franklin is over here on this side. And Franklin is a big admirer of Teddy Roosevelt. And so what he does is he sets his career path to follow that of Teddy Roosevelt. And he said, I'm going to have every single job Teddy Roosevelt had, and it's going to lead me to the presidency. And, everybody's like, yeah, okay, good luck, right? Well, here we are, right, 80 years later, and come to find out, that's exactly what happened. He followed his path and became president. So let me see if I can get this to come in a little tighter. There we go. We're going to talk. Let's, we're close. We've known each other now for 2 weeks. So what happens is this. FDR says, I'm going to be a state senator, just like Teddy Roosevelt. I'm going to be a governor like Teddy Roosevelt. I'm going to be assistant secretary of the Navy like Teddy Roosevelt. I'm going to run for president, and I'm going to be president of the United States, just like Teddy Roosevelt. And that's exactly what he did. FDR did not like working for the law and did not like, working in law as a career. And so what he did was he said, okay, I'm going to, I got to get out of this. I got to do something else. And what he wanted to do, of course, was the politics. So there was a New York State Senate race here in the Hudson Valley. And what happened was the guy that had the position didn't know if he wanted to run again or not run again, run again or not run again. So he dragged his feet until 4 weeks before the election. And he finally said, I don't want to do it. So FDR said, aha, this is my opening. I will run for that seat. So he ran for the New York State Senate here in the Hudson Valley, and he had just 4 weeks to run his campaign. And he set a goal for himself to speak at every crossroads in Dutchess County. And he did pretty much that. One of the ways that he won over the support of folks here in the Valley was that he hired a little red roadster. Now we're talking 1910 here, okay? So to see a red roadster in 1910 was pretty cool. So he hired a little red roadster, and he said, all right, I can't just give like a speech and that, I got to give like 5 or 6 speeches a day, 10 speeches a day. And so that's why he hired the roadster, so he could buzz around Dutchess County and the district and give these speeches. And it got to the point where the Republicans got so angry at this. Like, wait a minute, you only have 4 weeks and you're making up that time by buzzing all around the place, giving speeches and such. And Roosevelt's like, well, I want to win. I want to get this job. So what happened was the Republicans put out a rumor. And the rumor was that Franklin Roosevelt had been killed in a car accident, in a little red roadster accident on Clove Mountain here in Dutchess County. And of course, this was like, like fake news, right? Original fake news. And so what they said was, all right, well, he was killed. So, that dissuaded a lot of people from voting for him. But FDR said, no, I'm alive. I'm well. And he continued to give his speeches all around with this red roadster. And in fact, the crowd sizes began to double and to grow from there. And he used to start his speeches with, well, I don't know how many of you are here to hear my policies or how many are here to see a corpse give a speech. But whatever it is, I'm glad you're here. And here's what we're going to talk about. And so he was able to win that election, and he became part of the state Senate. Now, when he was in the state Senate, he got involved in a lot of agriculture and conservation type committees and things like that in the state legislature. And he ended up getting tangled into the Democratic machine up in Albany, which is our state capital. And of course, he wanted to make a political career for himself. So he was, trying to, rub elbows and make these connections and such. And he made such good connections that he actually was asked to put Woodrow Wilson's name in nomination for the presidency. And when Woodrow Wilson won the presidency, he rewarded FDR by appointing FDR to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And this is another job that Teddy Roosevelt had. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt built up the Navy, remember, and he sent them around the world on this big show of force, and so now FDR, during the Wilson administration, is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, this is a really important job for him because this is the first of 2 dress rehearsals that Franklin Roosevelt had for the presidency. And he had 2 dress rehearsals that made him, what most people consider to be a great president. Now, you could disagree with some of his policies, you can disagree with his programs and those sorts of things, but, he's always ranked among the top 3 presidents. And in fact, Laura has set aside, 3 sessions to talk about this guy because of this. So the first dress rehearsal he has for the presidency is he's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War. And what this does is it gives him the experience of getting supplies and material and men and ships and all those things over to Europe to fight the First World War. And this becomes a really good skill to have when he becomes commander-in-chief during the Second World War. And so this is the first of those dress rehearsals. And he later says that this was his favorite job. He loved being the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, after that, he decided to run for vice president with a man by the name of Cox from Ohio, and they ended up losing the presidency. And so Franklin Roosevelt was kind of out of a job at that point. So he said, all right, well, I got to figure out what I'm going to do from here. And before he had a chance to do that, this is 1921, he contracted polio. And what people don't understand about Franklin Roosevelt and polio is that when Franklin Roosevelt got polio, it at first impacted his entire body. He was unable even to lift a soup spoon when he first got this. For the first 6 or 8 weeks or so, his entire body was immobilized. Now, eventually it settled in his legs and he was able to regain his upper body strength. And he spent 7 years trying to teach himself how to walk again. And he was never able to do that. He was able to create the illusion of walking by locking his leg braces and then basically swinging his body, his upper body strength forward. And it was nothing more really than a series of controlled falls. And before he went too far, he would swing his body and he'd get his leg out in front of him, and that would keep him from falling. And he did that. And he was able to do that short, like, maybe 5, 6, 7 steps at most at a time. While he's convalescing over the polio, he sends Eleanor Roosevelt out through the state and out through the country to keep his name alive politically. And Mrs. Roosevelt was a huge influence in Franklin Roosevelt's career, both in becoming president and also, during the Great Depression and also during the World War. And I don't know if you're still listening, Laura, but we've got some great talks on Eleanor Roosevelt if anybody's interested. We can come back and do a whole series on her. So anyway, the way it works is this. He sits home here in Hyde Park and he's trying to rebuild his body strength and get back out there in politics. And what ends up happening is Eleanor Roosevelt keeps his name alive, so that 7 years later, when he runs for governor of New York, people remember him, and people know, hey, this is that guy that was Assistant Secretary of the Navy and a state senator, and he's able to win the governorship of the state of New York. This is the second dress rehearsal for the presidency, because now he is the governor of the state of New York, which at that time was the largest state in the Union, during the first 4 years of the Great Depression. So while Hoover is in the White House in Washington, running the country into the ground with the Great Depression, President Roosevelt, or Governor Roosevelt, is in New York State, and he is beginning to build this idea of a series of programs, and this series of programs is going to become the New Deal. Okay, so the New Deal programs were actually tried out as small experiments here in New York State before they were taken up to the federal level. And Roosevelt had 4 years to tinker and play and mess around with those sort of things before he took office in March of 1933. So what happens is he runs for president, and he runs for president against Hoover. Now, poor President Hoover had become sort of a giant political outcast. Everybody blamed him for the Great Depression, and that was very unfair, okay? Because what happened with the Great Depression was just this incredible series of events that all kind of culminated all at the same point, and they kind of came down and, you know, landed right on President Hoover. President Hoover did exactly what he said he was going to do. He was elected to rule over small government, small conservative government. But when the forces of the Great Depression hit, what happened was he didn't have any ideas on what to do about it. And he wasn't inclined to do a whole lot about it because of his conservative background. So Hoover did exactly what he said he was going to do. He did exactly what we hired him to do, but he was in over his head in terms of the crises that were going on. And he's now blamed, you know, for creating the Great Depression. But that is totally unfair and totally, inaccurate. But here's what happens. In that 32 campaign, people are tired of Hoover, right? You know, this guy, you know, this is the kind of thing you end up with these guys here in the background. Let me go back to the big set here. Come on. You can do it. No, maybe you can't. All right. Well, you see that guy standing over my shoulder over here? Over here? There he is, right? He is looking for work. And so what happens is there's a landslide victory for President Roosevelt in 1932. Now, back in those days, you were elected in November and you didn't take office until March. So there was a 6-month period where the old president, Hoover, had been basically unelected, but he was still president. And the new president, President Roosevelt, hadn't yet taken power. And it's a little known fact, but we almost didn't have a President Roosevelt. And the reason for that is this. On Valentine's Day, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt was in Miami, Florida, and he was down there resting up for the presidency. And there was a guy by the name of Giuseppe Zangarin who had it in for anybody that was rich and anybody that was well connected. And so he went to this park where FDR was, and he tried to kill him. He, shot at the President Roosevelt while President Roosevelt sat in his car. Now, he didn't hit President Roosevelt, but he did hit the mayor of Chicago, okay, a guy by the name of Shermack. Now, I want to be very clear, Shermack was in Miami with the president, right? One time I said this to a school group. I said, well, they were in Miami and this guy shot at the president and he killed the mayor of Chicago. And the kid was like, wow, what a great shot. You mean he was able to? No, he didn't shoot from Miami all the way to Chicago. The mayor of Chicago happened to be there. And so this created this aura around President Roosevelt that this guy tried to kill him, but he wasn't killed, and he was alive, and that maybe God or whoever or somebody or fate or whatever you want to believe in had put this Roosevelt guy in this place at this time to take America forward. So by the time he gets to office on March 4th, 1933, by the time he gets to become president, there is this sort of aura around this guy. Wow, he's not Hoover. He's got some ideas. He escaped an assassin. This guy's going to be good. And so Roosevelt gets up there, and at the very first thing he says to the country is, I pledge myself to a new deal. He said that at the convention. And then he gets up there and he builds on that. And he says, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Now, let's take a look at that statement. When President Roosevelt comes to power in March of 1933, the United States is at the height of the Great Depression. The unemployment rate is 25%. The underemployment rate is another 25%. So a quarter of the population can't find jobs. Another quarter of the population can find jobs, but they're not well-paying jobs. The banks were going under at about 1,000 banks per month, and the farms in the country were going under at about 1,000 farms per month as well. The nation's suicide rate had tripled during the Great Depression because people lost hope. People lost the sense of, things were going to get better ever. And one time they asked John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, if they asked him about the Great Depression. They said, "Oh, have you ever seen anything like this before?" And he said, "Well, there was one thing that was like this." He said it was the Dark Ages, and it lasted 400 years. Right? So people were like really shocked, in this time frame. So for the new president, to get up there and say the only thing we have to fear is fear itself was kind of a nutty thing to say, right? Wait a minute, we've got 25% unemployment, 25% underemployment, suicide rate is tripled, banks shutting down 1,000 a month, farms going under 1,000 a month, and you're telling me I have nothing to fear but fear itself? But what this did was it helped with that Roosevelt aura of the sense of confidence. Here's a picture of President and Mrs. Roosevelt on their way to the inauguration. This guy doesn't look worried about a Great Depression. This guy doesn't look worried about unemployment and those sorts of things. Now, of course he is, but he's on his way off to the inauguration. And the thing about this, folks, is that the thing that really sort of drove this was the sense that there was a sense of confidence, that they had somebody that knew what was going on, that you didn't have a Hoover who just, sat there on his hands and didn't know what to do, but you had this captain of a new ship, this guy Roosevelt, and he was sailing the ship of state through this sea of confidence. And this is what happened with Roosevelt when he comes to power. Can we take a second or two and talk about what happened with the Great Depression and what caused it? Because that might be a little bit helpful. Basically, there were 5 or 6 key things that came into play with the Great Depression. The first was a world banking crisis based upon the end of the First World War. Countries had borrowed to fight the war, and then when the war was over, they were supposed to pay the money back to the countries that they had borrowed from. They weren't able to do that. They went into default, and the countries that had lent the money were counting on that money coming back. Suddenly, they didn't have it. So the entire world economic system became very shaky and very fragile. So that was one problem. In the United States, there was a great environmental crisis, which was called the Dust Bowl. And this was part of what led to the farms going under. There was a 9-year drought out there in what's called the Dust Bowl. And a lot of farms ended up looking like this. And this was because a lot of farmers came back from World War I and went to work out there farming. There had been a big wet period of about 6 years. So they thought, oh, this will be great. We'll just throw some seeds down and things will grow. But then that wet period reversed itself and it became a 9-year drought. And this is what farms ended up looking like, the Dust Bowl. So then we had an economic crisis with the world banks, and you had an environmental crisis with the farming that was going on here in the country. You also had a consumer crisis. What happened was we had reached what they call market saturation. Throughout the 1920s, most people were doing pretty well, and they were buying a lot of stuff, and this was creating demand in the factories. People were in factories making this stuff, people were buying things, and the economy was booming. But by the end of the 1920s, people had bought pretty much everything they were going to buy. Right. So at this point, people had, maybe 2 radios. How many more radios do you need? You had maybe a car or 2. How many more cars do you need? How many more refrigerators? How many more electric fans? How many more vacuum cleaners? So we reached market saturation, and companies began to lay people off. The car companies didn't need to hire as many people, nor did the vacuum cleaner company, nor did the radio company or the refrigerator company. And this began a spiral down economically. And then, of course, you had the stock market crash. And this is what everybody points to as the beginning of the Great Depression. but it's not true. It was the Great Depression started 10 years earlier for farmers, as we just saw. What the stock market crash was when it got everybody's attention. So have you ever had a situation where you're not feeling well, right? It's Monday, you're like, oh, I don't know, maybe I'm still just hungover from the weekend, right? So you say, oh, I'll just, rest up a little. And then Tuesday rolls around and you're still not feeling so good. You're like, I don't know, I don't feel so good, right? And then Wednesday rolls around and you wake up thinking, all right, I got to be better by now, but you're not. And so you take your temperature and the thermometer says, oh, you got 103-degree temperature. That's what the stock market crash was. It was when we finally took the real temperature and found out, hey, you know what? We haven't been feeling well for a while, and this is what gets your attention. So now you got the fever, you call the doctor, and the game begins. So you have an economic problem with the world banks. You have a problem with the environment. You have a problem with market saturation, and you have a problem with the stock market. People were manipulating the stock market. People were what they call buying on margin, getting into the stock market to buy stock with money that they borrowed from people. Brokers were letting you, buy stock on with like just a 10% down. And as long as the stocks are going up, that's a good thing. But when the stocks start coming down, that's a bad thing. And that's what led to the Great Depression. So poor President Hoover, way in over his head. He doesn't know how to deal with all this stuff. But in comes Franklin Roosevelt, and he has been dealing with some of this stuff back in New York State as small experiments first. And this idea of the New Deal comes into Washington, and he's able to say, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, because he says, I got some ideas, and I'm going to put some things together. Now, if you ask the average person, can you name some New Deal programs? You might say things like, well, there's the CCC and, the WPA and ESPM and QVC, right? And you say those sort of things, but there were actually over 44 programs of the New Deal. And here is the periodic table of the New Deal. And this was something we created about 15 years ago to let people know that there was a lot of stuff that Roosevelt was doing. And there were actually over 44 programs of the New Deal. And the thing that pulled them all together were what we call the 3 R's. Roosevelt's New Deal programs were kept together with a concept called the 3 R's. What are these programs designed to do? They are designed to bring about relief, recovery, and reform, all right? Relief, recovery, and reform. How do we get people relief? We've got you guys sitting out there. I see Susan and Fran and Cindy and Linda and Jim, and you guys maybe haven't had a good warm meal in a couple of days. How do we get you a good warm meal this afternoon? How do we get you into a nice warm jacket or a nice warm apartment so that you're not living on the street, right? This is this idea of relief. How do we bring about immediate assistance to you? The second part of this is the second R is recovery. How do we get the farmers back in the farms? How do we get the bankers back in the banks, the factory workers back into the factories? How do we get the economy working again? How do we get the economy moving again? And then the third thing is reform. How do we prevent this from happening again? How do we prevent a second Great Depression? Now, the thing about this is Roosevelt had a little secret formula that he wanted to use, and actually had a couple of little secret formulas. But the one with the New Deal was he wanted to create jobs, right? So we're going to bring about relief, recovery, and reform, and we're going to do it with jobs. So things like the Work Progress Administration, things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, things like the Civilian Conservation Corps. These were all programs that Roosevelt had tried out to one degree or the other, in one form or the other, here in New York State, and then he brought them to the federal level. And the idea was to create jobs, because if you create jobs, you create two things. One is you create a paycheck for people, right? So if I got some money, I got a paycheck, woo-hoo, now I've got a job, I got a paycheck, I'm gonna go downtown, and tomorrow night, Friday night, I'm gonna buy a pizza. And when I'm done with that, I'm going to go bowling, right? And so now I'm spending that money. Why? Because I've got money to spend. If I don't have that job, I don't buy the pizza and I don't go bowling, which means that the bowling alley lays people off, the pizza place lays people off. So you got to get jobs, so you've got paychecks, so you can stimulate other parts of the economy. But even more important than that, in the mind of Franklin Roosevelt, was giving people a purpose. Think about it, right? Many of you are probably retired, but we identify ourselves by what our job is, right? I'm an educator. Laura's an educator, right? Maybe you are a retired fireman or a retired banker or a retired teacher or a retired farm worker, right? But you still identify yourself by what your job was. And Roosevelt knew that if there weren't people to have a sense of a purpose, that this was going to be a major problem. This is where the suicide rate triples. And this is where people like Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, right? These guys come to power as dictators because what are they doing? They're giving people a purpose. You now are in the party that I am running. And so now you are a party member. And because you are a party member, I'm going to give you, something to do through the command economy. We're going to make you, make tents and tanks and planes and those sorts of things. I'm going to put you in the military. And so Roosevelt understood that if you didn't have a purpose, you didn't have a job, then you were more susceptible to buying into those sorts of things. And you have to remember, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, that we were really at a breaking point in the Great Depression, right? John Maynard Keynes, the only thing we ever saw like this was the Dark Ages, 400 years. There's a story about Franklin Roosevelt goes in on the first day in office, and he's working there at his desk. And the clerk comes in, and the clerk, wants to suck up to the new president. And he says, boy, Mr. President, these programs you're doing, these New Deal programs, and these things work, you're going to go down in history as the greatest president ever. And the story goes that without even looking up, Roosevelt said, and if they don't work, I will go down in history as the last president ever. That's how close it was. Communism sneaking in, socialism sneaking in, anarchy sneaking in. So what Roosevelt did when he created the New Deal programs was he created jobs which helped the economy. He created jobs which gave people a purpose. And what he did was he helped to save not just the economy, but also democracy, because he was able to prove that the democratic capitalistic system will work if we maneuver it and tinker with it just a little bit. So let me give you an example of this 3 R's that I usually use with students to give you an idea of how this stuff works. So let's say it's tomorrow night and you're watching your favorite movie, right? And you're eating popcorn and you bite down on one of those hard kernels and you crack a tooth, right? Well, it's 9:30 at night, the dentist isn't open. So you say, oh my gosh, I just cracked a tooth. So you bring about this idea of Roosevelt. You say, oh, I'm going to do the 3 R's like Roosevelt did. So you take some aspirin, you put some ice on that tooth, and that creates the relief. How do you get immediate assistance in what it is that you've got going on? Then in the morning, you call the dentist and you say, hey, I cracked a tooth last night. I need to get this thing taken care of. And they say, okay, come on in. And you go into the dentist and they drill it out a little bit and they put it, the pack in there and they give you a cavity, they fill the cavity, they repair the tooth. And that is the recovery, getting the tooth back to working order. And then as you're walking out the door, the dentist says, hey, don't be eating any more of those kernels, stick to the white fluffy part. And that is the idea of reform, creating the ideas of how do we prevent this thing from happening again. So that's relief, recovery, and reform. And the Great Depression was not ended by the New Deal programs. That's not what ended the New Deal programs. The Great Depression. What ended the Great Depression was World War II and the need for full mobilization. But what the New Deal did was it brought about that relief, that recovery, and that reform that got us through that dark time. Republicans, conservatives were saying, you're doing too much. You're messing with the market mechanism. You shouldn't be doing that sort of stuff. You're doing too much. You're creating too much government programs, and you're taxing us too much to pay for those programs. The political left, the liberals, were saying, Mr. President, you need to do more. this is an unprecedented time in American history. Stop tinkering and take bigger steps. And when Roosevelt understood that he was getting criticism from both sides, he knew he was right where he needed to be. Now, one of the tools, one of the formulas that he also used, not just the 3 R's, was he used radio to communicate with folks. And he gave his famous fireside chats. And his fireside chats were based upon a 3-part formula. First, he would get on the radio, and the first part of the formula was he would tell you what the problem was. My friends, I'm here tonight to talk about banking, right? So here's what he's going to talk about. Not farming, not national security, but banking. I'm giving you one thing we're talking about tonight. It's banking. Then he would lay out what he was going to do. So what I'm going to do is, because there's a banking crisis and banks are shutting down, I'm going to declare a bank holiday. Now, Roosevelt was very smart about the words that he used, because if he had said a shutdown or, a closure, that would have panicked people. But he said a bank holiday. People like holidays, right? But you don't like shutdowns. You don't like closures. So he declared it a bank holiday. And at the end of this week, we're going to go through, the Treasury Department is going to go through and look at these banks, and then the banks will reopen at the end of the week. So part 1, I'm going to talk about banking. Tell them what you're talking about. Part 2, tell them what the problem is and what you're going to do about it. And then part 3 was to ask them for their help or tell them what he wanted them to do. So when these banks reopen, I need you to go and put your money back in the banks. And he gave this talk his first week in office. He shut down the banks through the bank holiday. And he then, a week later, to his word, reopened the banks. And within 1 month, $1 billion, billion with a B, flowed back into the banking system. And this is how he helped to pay for the New Deal programs. Okay. Now, how did he create this from ever happening again? He created a thing called the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, right? Your money is guaranteed. You put it in the bank, it's going to be there when you come to get it, because the United States government says that's going to happen. Now, I happen to have here a piece of Urbin family history. This is my grandma's pocketbook. And whenever you saw pictures of my grandma, she always had this pocketbook over her arm, clutching it like this, right? So, there's grandma, going to church. She's got the pocketbook, and she's clutching it like this. There's grandma, going to the casino, right? And she's got the pocketbook, she's clutching like that. There's grandma coming out of the women's prison, and she's got the pocketbook, and she's all clutching it like that. I'd like to say she worked at the women's prison, but that's a story for another day. Now, I asked my mom one time, Mom, what has grandma got in that pocketbook? Every time you see her, she's got that pocketbook. And my mother said, well, you know what she had in there? $30,000 cash, because she never trusted banks again, right? Even though there was the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, she had lost her life savings in the banks crisis of the 1930s, and she never trusted banks again. So this is another legacy of the Roosevelt era, is people that lived through the Great Depression never really got over it, right? They never really got over it. You might remember your parents, getting cookies from the bakery and taking the string off the box and winding it up and putting it in the drawer, or, pushing out foil, to reuse that again. There was an old saying during the Great Depression, use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. Right? And that was a very famous saying during that time frame. So Roosevelt creates the New Deal programs as a way of bringing about relief, recovery, and reform during the Great Depression. Now, I just want to highlight one program, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. One of FDR's, actually, I'm going to highlight 2 programs. One of FDR's favorite programs was a thing called the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. And this was the model by which the New Deal programs were supposed to work. And what Roosevelt was trying to do was to bring about a win-win for as many people as possible. He wanted to create relief, recovery, and reform, but he wanted to help as many people in that process as he could. And the Civilian Conservation Corps was a great program for that, because what it did was it took young men ages 18 to 24 out of the cities. They couldn't find work, and he put them to work in rural areas, making bridges, building roads, setting up campsites, building visitor centers and those sorts of things, building fire towers in forests, those sorts of things. And so these young men got these jobs, and they were able to earn $30 a month, $1 a day, $1 a day. But it was a win for them because they got 3 square meals a day and a nice place to sleep, and they got $30 a month. Now, the way this worked was they could keep $5, $25 got sent back to mom and dad back in the city. So now the kid is winning because they've got a job and they've got $5 and a nice place to eat and a nice place to sleep. The family is winning because they are now getting $25 a month coming in to pay their rent, pay their food bills. They have one less mouth to feed because the kid is at the camp being fed by the government. Crime rates go down in the cities because crime is a young man's profession, right? You don't see too many old people, polygripping people in place and hitting them with canes and taking their money, right? It's usually gangs of young men that are involved in crime. So everybody wins in the deal. And the kid, the guy that's in the camp, in the CCC camp, they win because not only are they getting these jobs, but they're learning important job skills, how to order things, how to show up on time, how to work with others. They're learning basic carpentry, basic electric stuff. They're learning some skills that they can then use later on in life. So it's a win-win for everybody. And the communities that they're in are getting these campgrounds and these fire towers and those sorts of things. So wherever possible, Roosevelt was trying to create win-win programs for as many folks as he could. Another one of his favorite programs was this one. Any of you familiar with this? I bet you are. Good old Social Security. Woo-hoo! Huh? You're number one. Now, originally the cards were this size, but they discovered they didn't fit in wallets. All right. So they went down to the smaller size. But here's the deal with Social Security. Social Security was never supposed to be your retirement. The way Roosevelt envisioned this was actually as Social Security insurance, right? Just like insurance, you pay in hoping you'll never actually have to collect, right? Nobody pays fire insurance and says, boy, I sure hope the house burns down. Otherwise, we've wasted all that money on fire insurance, right? No, that's not what you're hoping for. So the idea of the Social Security was people would pay in, and this was all part of Roosevelt's overarching program. Social Security was set up to be like a stool. It was supposed to be like a stool. And when you have a stool, you need at least 3 legs for that stool to stay up, right? So the first leg of the stool was going to be the job programs. Let's create jobs, and this will give us a paycheck, give people a paycheck. And with that paycheck, they're able to save some money. So you get a job, you have some money, you put a little savings away. The second leg of the stool was supposed to be labor reforms so that companies would take care of their workers, things like pensions and unions and minimum wages and safe working conditions. So if you got a job at a good, safe company, you would keep that job, you would stay there. That would give you that income that came in. And between those two things, you should be okay. But if you weren't, the government was taking a little money out of your paycheck, putting it into Social Security. And then if you got too old to work, if you got too injured to work, if you're the breadwinner of the family passed away, the kids would get a benefit out of that Social Security pot. Now, the life expectancy for the average American was 65 years old in 1933 when 35 when the Social Security comes in. And you had to be, it was 62. This life expectancy was 62, but you had to be 65 to collect. So there was a little trick in there that a lot of people will kick before they get a chance to collect. The idea was there'd be more people paying in than were taking out. And Social Security originally had in it provisions for healthcare as well, but Roosevelt traded those away in order to get the basic program started. And the idea was he would come back and work in the medical stuff later on, which didn't happen, of course, until President Obama. So Social Security was supposed to not be your retirement. It was supposed to be a way of helping you out if you didn't have enough money at the end, when you were too old to work or whatever. So those are just two of the many, many programs of the New Deal. Let's open it up to some questions and answers. And again, the idea was that the relief, recovery, and reform create a paycheck so you've got money, but also people have a purpose, makes them less susceptible to political diversity and instability. And it was designed to get us through until the market mechanisms could pick up and work properly again.
I think we've got a couple of questions.
Okay.
Fran has her hand up, and then there's also a digital hand up with the number that's 2348. I don't know who that is. So Fran, why don't you go first? Oh, it's you. Okay.
Mr. Urbin, thank you so much. This is so interesting, mind-blowing. We watched the special on PBS about the Roosevelts, and I'm wondering if they consulted with you.
Well, they didn't consult with me personally, but they did consult with the library. Please call me Jeff. Mr. Urbin was my dad.
Okay.
So they consulted with the library. In fact, Ken Burns's team was here. They spent 5 years doing research on this to create that program. And one of the things I love about Ken Burns is that, a lot of times when you teach this stuff, you have to unteach what people already think they know. But when Ken Burns does a program, he's so good at this that he creates this program, and then you can just pick up and begin to teach from there. So if you enjoyed that, it's very, very accurate. They spent 5 years here going through our research room and we're looking at our 17.5 million pages of documents. So that was definitely, if they had consulted me, there would have been more, middle-aged, good-looking, bald guys in it, but there wasn't. So hey,
There would have been more.
I think so.
I think Marilyn has her hand up.
Thank you so much. You have a fabulous personality, by the way. Anyway, when we were at Chautauqua Institute, they had a course on FDR, and they showed a video of him actually speaking on the I Hate War speech, which that was August 14th, 1936. And on either side of him, on one side was the president of Chautauqua Institute, and the other side was Thomas Edison. They were very good friends, as I understand it. But the one thing I remember from the speech, I don't remember that much, was when FDR said, "I wish I could keep war from all nations, but that is beyond my power." And that's one of the things I remember. But it was just a very interesting course, like similar to what the things that you just said. And then the fireside chat, they talked about that, just tried to cover so much.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Yeah, there's a lot of Roosevelt story to cover, and that I Hate War speech is very, very important because President Roosevelt did hate war. He understood what war was all about, and we'll talk about that in our next section next week. He despised the fact that he had to be commander-in-chief during the Second World War. He didn't want to be fighting a war. He wanted to be running a country. And we'll talk about his leadership in World War II next week, and I think that point will become clearer.
Linda has a question. Linda, unmute yourself.
Yes.
There you go.
First, I want to thank you. That was really brilliant.
Thanks.
But also on the kind of uncomfortable side, so many things that you went over is happening, has been happening, is happening, and is the direction that this country's going in. And I don't see any Roosevelts on the horizon to keep us, going well. So it was kind of disconcerting to listen, though I know I do a lot of reading of history, and it basically just is circular. It just keeps coming around, just like the pandemic. I mean, it was the same thing. We're right in that cycle, that 100-year cycle. And so it was kind of hard to listen to you saying what you're saying because it is so on target. But the other thing that will be a little more uplifting is that, oh, and I hope you do the Eleanor part because I've read all the books about her and it's great. But when my kids were little, I had a woman that worked for me and her name was Eleanor. And when my kids would fight, I would remind them that I hate war and Eleanor hates war.
That's great.
And my kids would walk around and say that when they were, done fighting. So
That's
that
awesome.
would just end on a laugh instead of a downer.
Yeah. Well, listen, Linda, I appreciate what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. Please don't let my talk be depressing. One of the things I find so amazing about history is I look at it and I feel uplifted. I feel, you know what? We've been through tough times before. We've been through pandemics. We've been through world wars. We've been through all this stuff before. And we got through it. We made it through it. Now, I agree with you. Much of that was the leadership of President Roosevelt during that incredibly difficult time, and the leadership of Abraham Lincoln during that incredible time, and the leadership of Harry Truman during that incredible time. So what we really need are good leaders. And I'm not criticizing any leaders that we currently have because God knows I need this job. But what I'm saying is this, that I somewhat disagree with you. You know, there's that old thing of, oh yeah, history repeats
I hope
itself.
so.
Yeah, no, I don't believe that history repeats itself. I believe history echoes, right? And if you stand on the edge of a cliff and you say, hello, 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 right? Your voice comes back. It's the same voice, but it's coming back in different directions. It's coming back in different intensities. And that's what I love about history, because we're not repeating, you never repeat exactly the same history, but you do have these episodes, these echoes that come back over and over again. And if we're smart enough to notice those, and we're smart enough to pay attention to those, then we can be smart enough to understand that we can avoid this stuff. And that's why I think teaching history and learning history and reading history as you do is so important, because it shows you we've been in these places before and we've been able to get our way through. And that's the thing we always try to get. I work with 35,000 students a year that come through here. And, when I got this job 23 years ago, right, they said, oh, okay, you got to talk to like second graders about depression and war and Nazis and polio and Holocaust, right? And I'm like, yeah, and Child Protective Services is going to hold me out of cuffs, in cuffs, because that's child abuse talking about all that stuff. But the idea of this is we need to understand where we've been so we can get a sense of where we're going. So please don't be discouraged.
I wish we had learned, because if you look at what's going on right now, the rising anti-Semitism, this ridiculous debt ceiling thing, the market. I mean, I know I'm sounding like a downer, but I'm also a realist, and all this stuff is going on right now.
Yeah, we're going to get through it, Linda. You're going to be okay. You're right. We could use another Roosevelt, but we're going to be okay.
Hey, Jeff, I was going to throw something out. When we were talking about Harry Truman a few months ago, I kind of saluted my grandmother, who introduced me to President Truman one day on a walk in Jefferson City. And I'm going to salute my grandfather, who was her husband, because he and his father found work during the Great Depression in Fort Peck with the earthen dam, and that was part of Roosevelt's program. And the history of my family changed dramatically because of that. And I know there are a lot of stories like that. So that's my contribution to a more upbeat aspect of the story, because it's still rippling through history and through family stories like mine.
That's exactly right, Laura. And, not a couple of months goes by that somebody doesn't come in and say, oh, exactly that. My grandparents, or that made all the difference, or that changed everything. And did you know that half of the infrastructure in this country was built during the Great Depression through the New Deal programs? And that is why it's falling apart now, right?
Right,
Because
so
it's 80 years old. But half of our infrastructure was built during the Great Depression, investing in the country, investing in the future. And I will make the argument next week that we won the Second World War in large measure because of the New Deal programs, because we had that infrastructure, because we had those young people that had, learned job skills through things like the CCC and the TVA and those sorts of things, that we were able to get up and into that fight. And, we were actually able to produce 80% of the munitions used by the Allies during the Second World War. And we'll talk more about that next week. Now, I hope that, and we still got a couple of minutes, so we'll take another question or two, but I hope that, it's always so hard to talk about this stuff because there's so much to cover, there's so much to cover. But what I was trying to do was to cut through the middle and give you kind of an overview of, how he got there, what he was thinking, the 2 dress rehearsals, the 3 R's and those sorts of things. So I hope I gave you a nice overview, but, you always feel like the sheriff's going to come in and arrest you for all the things you didn't talk about, but that's the way it goes.
does anybody else have any questions or comments?
Oh, I have one. And then he also, did you mention this? I forgot the Emergency Banking Act, because that was so important, reorganizing the banks and everything and close the different ones and so forth. And
Yep.
what is FCC? I know what an FHA, that those were some of the things, what the programs too. What is, and the SEC, I know what that is, and the FDIC.
Let's go to our beautifully handcrafted program sheet here. FCC, Federal Communications Commission.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's interesting about this, and people forget this, if I were king of the world, and this goes kind of to your point, Linda, if I was king of the world, I would take a magic wand and I would wave it one day a year and take away everything that government does for you, right? Because, government does a lot of stuff, but some of it has become so natural and so part of what we do that we tend to forget that. So even something like the FCC that was created during the Great Depression, that's what determines who our channels are for our cell phones, right? So it's still going on today, right? It's still being used today. So many of our programs, things like Social Security, things like the Food and Drug Administration, things like the National Labor Relations Board, the fact that most of you probably worked a 40-hour work week and, weren't killed in a factory because of bad working conditions. All of these things come out of the programs and the policies of the Great Depression. So yeah, we talked about the bank, you had to stabilize those banks because the banks is where the money is. And once that $1 billion started pouring back in within that month after the bank holiday, the banks were then able to use that money to give loans to the government and to individuals and to businesses that were able to stimulate the economy. People always say, well, how do we pay for all of this stuff? Well, we paid for it, the Great Depression in 2 primary ways. One was to get the money back in the banks, right? So that we could draw upon that, create a pool of capital. There was also like a 90% tax rate, right? So the rich were being taxed and that money was coming in. And that money was then used to build the infrastructure that we, have enjoyed over the last 80 years or so. Anybody else?
Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Okay, I think that wraps up another wonderful session with Jeff, and we look forward to next week's session. And then I think we're going to talk about Eleanor someday soon.
Oh, did you happen to know I do an Eleanor program? I don't know if I.
That'll be wonderful.
Thanks, everybody. Hey, listen, have a great week
Thank
between
you.
now and
Thank
then.
you.
And we'll see you then.
We'll see you next week.
Discussion. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, thank you for tuning in, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.